Hi everybody. Today I want to give you a brief update on neurons and synapses and how neurons communicate with one another. It's really important, I think, to understand this basic concept before you can truly go on and understand the brain or the rest of the nervous system. So the neurons are basically the building blocks of our nervous system. They're the cells that make up the nerves that make up the nervous system. And in the human body, we talk about three different types of neurons. We talk about sensory neurons, and these are over here. And the sensory neurons, they bring in information from the external environment. So as I'm looking at this camera, my sensory neurons and my eyes are being activated by the light waves. So sensory neurons activated by external stimulation. So sensory neurons are responsible for sensation, and we'll talk about that more in Chapter 3. Then we also have the motor neurons, and the motor neurons are responsible for any type of motor movement or muscle movement in the body. So as I'm moving my hands to talk to you, then the motor neurons in my arms are all activated in order to get my hands to move. And then finally we have the inter or association neurons, and those are the neurons that are located in the central nervous system, and that is the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord, interneurons or association neurons, and basically what the inter or association neurons do is they connect the motor and the sensory. So visual information comes in through my eyes. That information goes to my spinal cord, to my brain, to the visual cortex, which we'll talk about later. It's interpreted, and then I decide whether or not there's an action that needs to be taken. So if my sensory neuron, if I was walking down the hall and I saw one of my good friends, then my sensory neurons would take in the information that this is my friend and would send that information to my brain to process, and then it would say turn around and say hello. Okay, and the turning around and saying hello would be the inter or association neurons that have just spoken to your motor neurons to get you to turn around and to get your mouth to actually say the words hello. Next, I want to talk about the structure of an actual neuron. And hold on, I think that may be better. The structure of an actual neuron. So we'll take a look at a neuron. Most neurons have all of these parts. They can look very different. You can see that in your text. But on the test, really focus on the processes we've talked about here. What are the things we talk about here? Oops. So next we'll talk just briefly about the soma or the cell body. That is the part of the neuron that contains the DNA and is responsible for survival of the neuron. So, and you can see that here in the blue box. The cell body or the soma contains the nucleus, contains the DNA, and responsible for survival of the neuron. Next, these branch-like structures, and it would include all the way around the cell body or the soma. So all these branch-like structures, those are the dendrites, and the dendrites are responsible for taking information in. So they bring information into a neuron. Neurons, the information in a neuron travels one direction only, so it comes in through the dendrites to the cell body and down through the rest of the neuron. It cannot go backwards, and you can tell that from these arrows here. It's unidirectional. One thing that's important to understand about the dendrites is dendrites do grow. So I know you've heard that once you kill a brain cell, pretty much you've killed the brain cell and it will never reproduce. That's mainly true as far as we know right now, though we have found a few areas in the brain where there actually can be some neurogenesis or regeneration of neurons. We'll talk about that later. But generally, neurons don't, in your central nervous system, do not regenerate. If they did, if you suffered from a spinal cord injury, your neurons in your spinal cord would simply heal and you would be able to walk again. That's not generally what happens. However, we do have the ability to grow new dendrites, and new dendrites can grow through your entire lifespan. They grow very rapidly in early childhood and infancy, but can continue to grow during the lifespan. So if we have a neuron that dies, let's pretend there was a simple chain of neurons A and B and C, and A is talking to B and B is talking to C. If B died, then what would happen is C could actually grow enough new dendrites to connect to neuron A. So it's how we can get around the fact that our mature neurons generally don't regenerate. Then the next thing, so you have the dendrites bringing the information in. They bring the information into the cell body or the soma, and then that travels down the axon. The axon is the beginning of the cell's output structure, and the axon would be the pink inside this white here. And so if the neuron is going to communicate, the information would travel from this cell body and it would go down the axon, and we'll follow it through the rest of the neuron. Then it would go to the axon terminal branches, and the terminal branches you can see here, they're the branching like structure down at the end. And then finally they would go to the axon terminal buttons, and the button would be at the top at the end of each of the axon terminal branches. And so it travels from the dendrites to the cell body or soma, down the axon, to the axon terminal branches, to the axon terminal buttons. And there are circled the buttons in with the blue. One thing you may have noticed that we didn't talk about yet was the white substance on the outside of this particular axon. This is called the myelin sheath. The glial cells are responsible for producing and maintaining the myelin sheath, and it's basically a fatty substance that surrounds the outside of the axon. And it serves two purposes. The first purpose is it protects the axon. So imagine you can have axons that are as short as 1/2000th of an inch. They can vary all the way up to 39 inches long. And that's a huge, long axon. And it is microscopic. And so think about how easy it would be to break. But this fatty substance provides some protective coating. So the myelin sheath protects the axon. The other thing the myelin sheath does is the myelin sheath speeds the information that travels down the axon. So as the information is traveling down the axon, if it has a myelin sheath, it can move from here, and you can see where I'm pointing at the beginning of this myelin sheath, and then it would jump to the juncture, and jump to the juncture, and jump to the next, and jump to the next, and jump to the next. So the key thing here, it would be like, think about taking steps. If you're walking forward and you have to touch toe to heel, toe to heel, toe to heel to walk across a room, versus if you can take a step, and the step may be 2 feet, in length. How much faster would it be for you to get across the floor if you can take normal steps versus heel to toe, heel to toe, heel to toe? So that's what the myelin sheath does. It allows basically the communication to jump or to take steps between those junctures in the myelin sheath. When the neuron is at rest, there are more negative potassium ions on the inside of the neuron, and that is through the neuron, and there are more positive sodium ions outside of the neuron. The neuron is still at a consistently ready state, and the reason for this is because those positive and negative neurons are attracted to each other like opposite poles of a magnet. So they're trying, the positive on the outside are trying to break in and get into the inside. And then if we have the positives break in, then we would actually have the neuron firing. So here's what happens when the neuron takes action. So the dendrites would get activated, and we'll talk about how that happens in a minute. But the dendrites get activated. The membrane opens, allowing those positive ions to enter. If enough of the positive ions enter, then that neuron will pass the threshold. And if it passes the threshold for the ratio of positive to negative ions, then it would create an action potential, which is a surge of electrical energy, and that surge of electrical energy will now travel down the axon to the axon terminal branches to the buttons. So dendrite's activated, membrane opens, allows positive in, if enough, passes the threshold, creating this electrical impulse called an action potential, which travels down the axon to the branches to the buttons. And here you can see what's happening when the action potential is occurring. And remember, the action potential is that the surge of electrical energy. And so what happens, and it would only happen at the nodes of Ranvier if you've got the myelin sheath, and that means it's only at those junctures in what looks like kind of like this sausage. But what happens here is, as you're moving down at each node of Ranvier, a gate opens that allows the positives to come in, and then it pushes the negatives out. Then pushes the positives out. So positives are allowed in, and then positives are pushed out, and then positives are allowed in, and then pushed out. And that would only have to happen at the nodes of Ranvier if it has myelin sheath. If it doesn't have myelin sheath, it's like, sewing, where you have to have each stitch right next to each other instead of like a block stitch where you can stitch like this. So the same thing with the finger steps. And then it's important to understand that when you're talking about between neurons, we move to a different kind of communication. So inside the neuron is communicating through the electrical impulses. If enough positives enter, it passes the threshold, it creates the action potential, which is that surge of electrical energy that travels down the axon. So we've got electrical energy within the neuron. When an action potential occurs, what it does is it instigates a chemical message that communicates with the adjacent neuron. Okay, so adjacent neurons get communicated with through chemical messages. I'm going to pause here and give you a little break, and then I will come back in a part 2 and talk about the chemical communication between the neurons and move you into neurotransmitters and those chemicals themselves. Okay, bye.